I think what feels expensive isn't necessarily the garment itself. I think it's really that distance between how we're being taught to consume and what things actually cost to make, what they cost to maintain, and what they cost to preserve. So, I don't know if you're on the same corner of the internet as I am, but lately I've been seeing a lot of questions and critiques about vintage pricing. Issues with why a used jacket costs what it does, thinking that resale is becoming a scam. I mean, a lot of people are upset. So today, let's slow the conversation down and ask, why does vintage feel so expensive right now? So let's just start off by saying that I'm not going to sit here and gaslight y'all, okay? It is very, very real that the prices in a lot of situations are getting a little crazy, okay? They are getting a little wild. And I say this as someone who makes part of my living from selling vintage clothing. Really, what people are responding to, in my humble personal opinion, is that for a long time, secondhand shopping, and I do want to make the distinction that secondhand pieces don't necessarily qualify as vintage pieces, but just for the general sort of conversation, I'm just going to say secondhand. Secondhand shopping was really framed as something that was cheap, sometimes accidental if you found something good, and honestly just required a lot of luck. But that framing was never actually sustainable, in my opinion. For the majority of the 20th century, most garments were actually a significant expense. They were often repaired, they were handed down. I mean, this is where we get the hand-me-downs. They were altered and they were worn for years. I know that there's definitely a resurgence in upcycling, which is a new term, which is, I mean, it's just altering. But the reality is that when people are comparing vintage prices to fast fashion prices, they aren't comparing like with like. And I just want to be very honest about that. They are comparing industrial shortcuts to historical craftsmanship, which is not at all the same thing. I think we can all agree, right? Hopefully. I think for a moment, let's actually break down what vintage shopping includes, okay? I think there are a lot of things that are not actually considered when we think about vintage prices. So I not only say this as someone that sources, curates, and sells vintage in my shop, but I say this as a consumer as well, because there are plenty of times where there's something I want, I see it, I find it in this really great curation of vintage, and I see the price and I go, no. And I have to, honestly, I gotta reel myself back in sometimes. These are the things we need to be remembering. So let's actually get into what I'm going to refer as the modern cost stack. So we are actually going to create a stack of all the things that you are paying for when you choose to patron vintage. Okay? So let's start with our stack. We have sourcing and all of the time, transportation, cleaning and repair, mending, storage, rent, labor, platform fees, credit card fees, and increasingly, and I think this one is undervalued, education. So I want to be very clear that in our beautiful modern cost stack that we created, I have to pay for every single one of those things with my general operating costs of having this business and selling clothes. And I do want to be very, very, very transparent that not everyone who is selling vintage has a brick and mortar. That does not mean that they do not have storage costs or rent costs. Just because you don't have a physical location to go to does not mean that there is zero cost to the seller in terms of storing and holding all of these all of this inventory. I think another distinction that is incredibly important to remember is that oversaturation does not equal quality. Okay? Let me say that one more time. Oversaturation does not equal quality. Okay? So the market is oversaturated visually, but not materially. High quality garments are genuinely finite, and they are becoming even more so with the vast amounts of waste produced by the fashion industry. They are not being made at the same rate as they once were, especially with the prevalence of fast fashion, and especially with the prevalence of fast fashion with Gen Z. Scarcity genuinely does change value. I can give you a little anecdote here. One of our best sellers at the shop are our French tour jackets. We originally started selling those at the shop for $95, and we were able to get a pretty good margin because we were able to source them pretty cheaply, where we didn't need to have them at a lot of the prices that you would see online, which sometimes can be $200. Recently, in the first 3 months since opening our business, most of our suppliers for our European tour jackets have increased their prices. Most of those jackets are sometimes selling for around $400 to $500, and part of the reason isn't because the quality has suddenly magically changed. It is because more people want them and there are less of them. They're not being made anymore. So when we think about this idea of vintage feeling expensive, it's not because it suddenly just became this moment of greed. I think we really have to reckon with reality that for a brief moment in history, clothing became artificially cheap, and now we're really reckoning with the reality of that. So I think when people are asking whether or not vintage has become too expensive or has it just become a scam, I think the real question is whether or not the value has become unclear. I think that we have been trained to see clothing as disposable, and I think that a lot of the conditions of consumerism and capitalism and just the wastefulness of the fashion industry, in all honesty, I think it's really created this idea that clothing should be cheap, it should be endless, and it should be instantly replaceable. I think the thing about vintage is that it really disrupts that. It sort of breaks down that expectation, and it really asks us to confront time, it asks us to confront labor, and it also asks us to confront scarcity, and it's asking us to do that all at once, which is a lot to contend with. I think what feels expensive isn't necessarily the garment itself. I think it's really that distance between how we're being taught to consume and what things actually cost to make, what they cost to maintain, and what they cost to preserve. Vintage really sits in that sort of uncomfortable middle space. It's not fast, it's not mass produced, and it's not infinitely available. And in all honesty, I think a lot of people aren't really sure how to contend with that when it comes to actually purchasing that and paying for it. So I recently did a video where I did a quick sourcing trip at the thrift store. Now I do want to be very clear in saying that I spent 2.5 hours doing this sourcing trip. The video is not 2.5 hours, but that was 2.5 hours of my time of just looking for items. That did not include any of the cleaning, that did not include any of the steaming, any of the mending, any of the stitching and repairs, any of the identifying of the materials, the time period, the tagging, the inventory, the pricing. I mean, that was just 2.5 hours of finding the items. So no, I don't think that vintage is a scam. I think it's actually a reminder. I think it's a reminder that clothing genuinely does and should require care. I think that it reminds us that quality should be deliberate, And I think it also reminds us that value doesn't always align with speed. And I think that that is going to require a lot of retraining for a lot of us when it comes to thinking about the curations of our closets and our wardrobe. And I think that's another point as well, is that I think the art of creating a curated wardrobe is actually sort of a dying practice. I think a lot of us just buy mindlessly. We order online, we wait for it to come, we wear it a couple times, and then we donate it. And that cycle doesn't actually have us cherishing and valuing and, in all honesty, being curators of our own archives. And I think it's creating some dissonance between how wardrobes used to function before and the quality and care that was required to maintain them. And in all honesty, I think just an absence of what quality and care means today. No, I question, is the issue really with vintage being too expensive, or is the issue that we've been underpaying for clothing for way too long? That's all I have for you today. If this idea, this concept, this way of thinking about clothes as labor and material history and culture, then please share your thoughts below. I'm really curious about how other people are thinking about this. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what some of your thoughts are. Until next time, bye.